One minute the fields were clear, and the next moment, more Indians than I dreamed possible were in front of the fort. This is what Rachel Parker Plummer witnessed the morning that she was taken captive by a Comanche raid. In a horrifying attack, her home was destroyed and many of her family was killed. It felt like hundreds of mounted warriors came out of nowhere and without warning. Today, we're going to take a look at what it was like to experience a Comanche raid. Welcome to Dates and Dead Guys. The Comanche have a well-deserved reputation for being one of the most brutal and terrifying of the western tribes. Their territory, Comancheria, included the entire southern plains, an inhospitable territory that they had taken by force. As nomads, the mastery of the horse was essential to their power, and something new in their history. It was developed as the result of the introduction and escape of Spanish horses in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Comanche were unmatched in their abilities and were legendary as warriors and raiders. By the end of the 1700s, they had run their rivals, like the Apache, off of the plains, and only managed tense treaties with the Spanish prior to Mexican independence. But into the 1800s, American westward expansion was leading to clashes between settlers and the Comanche. It was inevitable. Manifest destiny demanded the United States conquer the whole continent from east to west. But gold in California made it so that early inhabitants could largely skip over Comancheria. A giant chunk in the middle of the west was left alone, which was good for a while. If the scarce nature of the plains didn't kill you, the inhabitants would have. The promise of land and flourishing farms drew in settlers by the thousands. It was inevitable that the nearby Comanche would take notice of these new, easy targets. Certain tribes could be bought, intimidated, or tricked, but the Comanche were not the type to negotiate. The previous 200 years had seen their culture experience constant expansion through brutal warfare. It's important to understand that with each passing generation, this lifestyle became more and more of who they were. And as raiders, they were the best. The introduction to the Spanish at San Saba the century prior serves as a good example. Tricked by the Apache, the Spanish built a mission in Presidio in the 1750s. The Apache had told the Spanish that they wanted to be Christianized. The Spanish built a compound for that purpose, but it soon became clear that the Apache had other intentions. They had insisted that the fort be built in what is now central Texas, near modern-day Maynard, Comanche territory. The Apache had been fighting and losing to the Comanche for decades. They had hoped to start a war between two of their enemies. And in March of 1758, they got it, with the arrival of the spring grass. In the morning of the 16th, the soldiers in the Presidio woke up to hear war whoops of 2,000 mounted Comanche warriors outside their walls. Initially, the Comanche pretended to be peaceful, but it was clear that they had other plans in mind. T.R. Fehrenbach wrote in his excellent book, Comanches, A History of a People, what the Spanish saw when they peered over the walls. Quote, "The savages were a breathtaking, barbaric spectacle. Plains Amerindians in the full panoply of war. The long lines of riders wore fantastic headdresses of plumes, deer antlers, and bison horns. Their faces were painted red and black, the color of death." End quote. Seeing the fortifications, the Comanche turned their attention away from the Presidio and to the priests in the mission not far from the fort. Outmatched, the Spanish commanders watched helplessly as the Comanches slaughtered 8 in the mission and burned it to the ground as they looted it. As a show of strength, they hung out for a few days outside the walls of the Presidio, before killing the Spanish cattle and, having made their point, leaving. This was the European introduction to the Comanche. Now, in the 1800s, if these settlers wanted to make this their home, this was the reality they faced. The dangers were extreme. One minute you could be completely safe within your home, and the next the wolves were at your doorstep. Accounts of settlers from the early 1800s through the 1870s paint a picture of what it was like to live on the frontier of Comancheria. The Comanche were brilliant raiders, so much so that their strategy even became famous. When war parties were put together, they would gather in small groups, or sometimes, like in the case of San Saba, they would travel with up to hundreds of warriors. Their mastery of the horse made them able to cover hundreds of miles in a time that most thought would be impossible. But raiding often came with a season. The best time for raids was when the spring grass had grown. This way, when the Comanche traveled, their horses would have plenty to forage. Raids are swift attacks. The goals are to gain supplies and valuables, sometimes captives. But when you leave, you don't want to be followed. So if they thought it would rain, they would hold off their attack. Mud would reveal their tracks. The Comanche liked to move in secret, at night, something other tribes like the Apache had taboos about. So they would wait for a full moon to help light their way. The ability to travel at night made their approach and escape easier. It didn't take long for the settlers to learn that when the grass was grown and the moon was full, they were in danger. These conditions to this day are sometimes referred to as the Comanche moon. As settlements continued to move into Texas, confrontations became more and more common. Records are hard to come by, but there are some estimates that suggest that in some years, as many as 200 settlers may have been killed. That number may be high, but the true number is definitely more than what's recorded. And when settlers got a chance to lobby politicians and generals on the conditions, it became an issue that was hard to ignore. Nelson Lee, a cattle driver who was captured by the Comanche in 1855, wrote of one of these raids. His party of 19 men was attacked just after 1 a.m. To enact terror in those caught off guard, the Comanche would scream and war whoop as they rode into camp. They would be fully painted, their faces often a demonic black. When Lee awoke to the sounds and chaos that was already in full swing, he was immediately lassoed and tackled to the ground before being taken captive. In the darkness, he could only hear the screams of the victims, but in the morning he reported what he saw. Quote, "The scene was cold and heartrending. They had cut and hacked the poor cold bodies in the most brutal manner. Some had their arms and hands chopped off. Others were disemboweled. And still, others had their tongues drawn out and sharp sticks thrust through them. All the dead were scalped, and the scalps, still fresh, were dangling from the savages' belts." End quote. Attempts made at reprisal against the Comanche were often met with disappointment. Stories of men who went after them on the high plains generally didn't end well. The Comanche were known to run off the horses of people in their territory, leaving them stranded when without effective means of transportation. Without even a fight, they would die of exposure and dehydration. They were lucky. Those captured met worse fates. Nelson Lee mentioned ceremonies, including the torture of victims. In his experience, he was one of 4 captives tied to a pole. The Comanche tribe watched as warriors danced around, slicing at 2 of the captured men with stone knives. They scalped them as their friends watched before putting them out of their misery with an axe to the head. The true mark of bravery in a man was how he dealt with pain. The Comanche were often eager to test the character of the condemned. In another example, the Comanche demonstrated their twisted creativity when they captured a buffalo hunter. Herman Lehman, a white settler who had been adopted by the tribe as a child, wrote of the experience. Quote, "He was almost scared to death and fell on his knees to beg for his life. The chief had him stripped and then made him put on an Indian's garb, and a war bonnet was tied to his head so securely that he could not get it off. Then the Indians made signs to him to run back to his white friends. He understood the signs and fit out, but when the white men saw him coming, they thought he was an Indian and shot him full of holes. He fell before he reached his friends." End quote. But maybe the best example of what a Comanche raid was like was from the most famous one, the Parker Fort Massacre in 1836. This raid became the most famous for a few reasons, and we'll get to them. But I'm going to tell the story through the eyes of one of the survivors, Rachel Parker Plummer. In 1836, Rachel was 17. She's been described as very pretty, with long red hair. She was married, and she already had a child, none of which was unusual for the time. The Parkers, herself, and her husband Luther, as well as several other families, had moved to Texas in the years prior. Like many settlers, they looked for land and opportunity. They were granted a plot off the Navasota River in present-day Limestone County. This was far beyond most white civilization, even on the frontier. It was well known that this was in the raiding zone for the Comanche, but most of the local natives had signed peace treaties with Texas. It was felt that with a fort, they would be safe, so they built one. It was massive, several acres in size. The Parker Fort was completely enclosed with 12-foot walls. It had only 2 entrances, a large gate in the front and a small one in the back. There were several cabins inside and 2 blockhouses for lookouts. The fort was meant to be a formidable barrier. Most of the inhabitants of the fort were relatives to the Parker family, but others had farms nearby and planned to use the fort for protection. Far from the high plains, they hadn't expected what was coming in May of 1836. Not without warning. The Comanche travel light and fast under the full moon. Raiding through the territory, they arrived at the Parker doorstep on the morning of the 19th. That morning was like any other for the inhabitants. Before 9 a.m., several of the men, including Rachel's father, husband, and brother, went out to tend to the fields on their farm. It was warm and peaceful. Rachel completed some chores and played with her 18-month-old son. But around 10 a.m., Rachel heard a cry from the field. Indians. Rachel ran to the blockhouse, where she peered over the walls of the fort. She related in her memoirs what she saw. Quote, "1 minute, the fields were clear, and the next moment more Indians than I dreamed possible were in front of the fort." End quote. Before the settlers even knew they were there, hundreds of mounted Comanche warriors appeared just a few hundred yards outside their walls. Everyone feared that this was a war party. But then they noticed the Comanche do something strange. They raised a white flag. In the fort, Rachel's uncles, Benjamin and Silas Parker, tried to organize everyone, but they argued on whether they should run, hide, or fight. Silas was 32, but his gray hair was a sign to most that he wasn't young and reckless. He wanted to fight from behind the wall. But Benjamin, 16 years older, knew that the walls were not high enough to stop a horde of Comanche with ropes from overrunning them. For anyone to survive, people would have to run and hide. As they argued, two of the Comanche approached the fort before the others. A gesture meant to signal that they wanted to talk. Benjamin decided to go speak to them. He wanted to buy the people inside time to gather their things before they ran. Silas pleaded with him not to go, but Benjamin was determined. He walked through the front gate, and Rachel watched her uncle as he went out to talk to the Comanche, alone. As Benjamin spoke to them, the Comanche from behind slowly started to approach. He was asked for information about a place to camp and where to find water, but the Comanche also asked for one of the Parker's cattle so they would have something to butcher and eat. Benjamin knew this wasn't really what they were after. The Comanche always knew where water was, and the Navasota River would not have been alien to them. One source I found even suggested that some of the Comanche horses were still wet from a recent crossing. Still, if Ben refused, they might attack him immediately, and he still needed to buy the people inside as much time as possible to escape. He instead said that he wanted to talk to his people before making the Comanche any promises. Surprisingly, he was permitted to return to the fort. Benjamin told everyone inside that he didn't believe the Comanche were peaceful. He said that the women and children had to leave, now. He wanted to go back outside to talk to the Comanche more, to buy more time for the people. But his brother Silas grabbed him and told him that if he went back out there, the Comanche would surely kill him. But again, Benjamin felt it was the only way to keep the Comanche off the fort for at least a few more moments. Before he left again, Rachel remembered him telling the men inside to mount a defense. Silas then turned to Rachel and said that he knew that they would kill Benjamin. He asked her to run to his cabin. It was inside the fort, so that she could grab his shot pouch. He already had his rifle. As Rachel peered over the fort, she saw Ben slowly approach the Comanche again. But this time was different. The warriors immediately started to surround him. She ran to grab the shot pouch for her uncle. Before she went to escape out the back of the fort, Silas promised her that he would take some of the Comanche with him. She grabbed her infant son and ran to the small gate in the back of the fort. As she left, she heard the screams of Benjamin. The killing had started. Gunshots and screams filled the air as Rachel ran from the fort carrying her 18-month-old son. It seemed to her that the Comanche were after her immediately. Others were running with her, but compared to them, she was slow and plodding. For the Comanche, catching her was a game. Before she made it a couple hundred yards, she was knocked down. The others escaping the fort continued to run into the forest. Rachel tried to cover her son, but the Comanche ripped him from her arms. As she tried to fight back, she heard more rifle fire. She wasn't sure where the sounds were coming from. She thought, are we being saved? Have the neighbors arrived to drive off the raiders? Within moments, her hope fades, and the shots stop. They were coming from inside the fort. The last of the fort's protectors had been defeated. Rachel was knocked down again. A warrior then grabbed her by her long red hair and dragged her all the way back to the fort. When the Comanche warrior finally let Rachel go, she was dropped next to the body of Benjamin. He had been mutilated and was full of protruding arrows. As each Comanche walked past, they continued to stick the body with spears. Rachel was forced to wait next to it. Covered in her own blood, she frantically looked around for where the Comanche had taken her son, and eventually she heard his cries. He was on a horse, being kept with two Comanche women. Rachel tried to run to him, but she was grabbed immediately by two of the warriors. She was beaten and whipped until she stopped crying. The Comanche then marched out their other captives. There were 3 more, including a 9-year-old named Cynthia Ann Parker. The Comanche who brought them out of the fort were holding scalps. Rachel noticed that one of them was gray. She knew it was Silas. Years later, she would learn that he had upheld his promise. He had gotten 4 Comanche before they reached him. She couldn't determine who the other scalps belonged to. As the captives watched, the Comanche plundered the fort. They destroyed everything they had no use for, including killing all of the cattle they didn't want to take with them. Before long, the captives were forced to start walking toward the high plains, leaving the destroyed fort and their lives behind. The Parker Fort Massacre is probably the most famous Comanche raid. If it is not, it is right up there with the Great Raid of 1840 and the San Saba Massacre. I debated for a long time how far to go into this story. There were 34 settlers present at the fort during the time of the raid. Shockingly, in the attack, the Comanche only killed 5, although an additional woman was injured. She was shot in the breast with an arrow. Another 5 were taken prisoner, among which were Rachel, her son, and Cynthia Ann Parker, a name that you may recognize. But 23 people, about 2/3, escaped. This was actually pretty common among raids. Killing people was rarely the point. The resources are, although sometimes people are resources. But once the threat had been established, the Comanche pretty commonly turned their attention to the plundering side of things, which makes sense. It is also what happened at San Saba. They could have done much more damage, but they didn't have to. They made their point. They got the things they came for, and they didn't have any substantial loss of life on their side. Raiders generally preferred soft targets. Native Americans took losses very seriously. It takes a long time to replace warriors, especially in small populations. I wanted to focus on the raid specifically for this video, but the story of the survivors is interesting within itself, as is the story of Rachel. Rachel will become a captive of the Comanche for about 2 years. I am reluctant to tell that entire story. It's fascinating, but tragic and very graphic. I have a very hard time believing that YouTube would find it appropriate. Her personal narrative is probably the best source, but you can find quality retellings in a number of other places, including S.C. Gwen's Empire of the Summer Moon and Indian Depredations in Texas by J.W. Wilbarger. But here is a PG-13 overview. Soon after being captured, Rachel was separated from her son, as well as the other captives like Cynthia Ann. She is constantly beaten and worked, and worse. Additionally, at the time of her capture, she is pregnant with a 2nd child. She does give birth to that child, but it is soon killed as caring for it interferes with her work. It is one of the most shocking and gruesome accounts I've ever read, but she is forced to continue. Eventually, she does earn a degree of respect in the tribe, winning a fight after she is being mistreated. The Comanche are interesting in that way. They definitely value courage. After about 2 years, she is sold to a trader from the Comanche, and from there she's going to be reunited with her family. In the brief time that she was back, she wrote of her experience. Twice, actually. But she would die in 1939, likely from complications a couple months after giving birth to a 3rd child. If that is a story people want to hear in its entirety, I will find a way to tell it. Let me know in the comments. As for the legacy of Comanche raids, this was by no means an isolated incident. There are many who experienced this, but there is another reason why the Parker raid is rather notable. One of the captives, 9-year-old Cynthia Ann Parker, would grow up as a Comanche. She will marry Chief Peter Nakona, and together they would have a son, Quanah Parker, the final war chief of the Comanche. Thanks for watching. If you liked that video, take a look at this other one I did on the 1871 Battle of Blanco Canyon. If you think that settlers had a hard time with Comanche raids, wait until you see what happens to the military.